As I mentioned previously, when we talk about Python and we talk about variables or even constants, which might be a value that doesn't change, we have the three data types that we previously mentioned. That is your integer, your float, and your string. Now, we don't end up having to worry about it as much as maybe other languages, because as I showed in the previous video as well, Python isn't strict with it. It allows you to switch types, and it tries to understand what you mean, and will make the changes necessary to make it work. Now, in other languages, not only might it be very strict about those types, but in addition, you have like subtypes. So when it comes to maybe an integer in Java, you have different types of integers, so to speak. So let me relaunch IntelliJ, and I'll show you what I mean. Now, this isn't necessarily important to Python, but if you're planning on becoming a programmer or really understanding code, it's important that you're aware of this because you will see this in other programming languages. So we have my super awesome variable here, right? And I used the integer type int. But there are other types too, like a byte. And we also have this other type here that IntelliJ is labeling as a double, but it's basically a float. When we talk about it in Python, we call it a float. It could be a float in this too, if we were to define it as a float. Java has both floats and doubles. Python just uses floats. What's the difference? We'll get into that. So this is okay for this byte to equal 34. So for right now, let's just increase the value of this. So we're just going to do plus plus, and let's run it. All right, so we have 34, and then we end up with 35 because we increased the value by 1, and that's fine. So you might be saying, what's the difference between a byte and an integer? Well, there's a few differences here and there. So I think an easy way to show the difference is to take this up a notch. Let's make this 125, and let's just remove a little bit of that spacing for now, just to be able to include more in here. And I'm just going to drop this down a few times. I could do a loop, but I haven't talked about loops yet, and I definitely don't want to talk about loops in Java for Python. So we're just going to run this, and we'll just see what happens. Now you can probably predict what's going to happen, right? 125, 126, 127, 128, 129, 130, 140, 150, etc., right? Until we get to that bottom one. What did I say? 130, 140, 150? 130, 131, 132, etc. So let's run it and see if that is indeed what happens. Well, look at that. Isn't that interesting? So we have the 125. It increases to 126, and it prints. It increases to 127, and it prints. It increases to not 128, to negative 128. That's a key difference. So different types of data can contain different values. This doesn't really matter in Python because of how Python works and how it was created and blah, 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 etc., etc. But in some of the more strict programming languages, like Java, there are different data types, like this byte type, and they have much stricter limitations into how many values they allow within it. And so when you hit 127 and you try to go up, it now takes you into the opposite side because it's not really like a line stretching from negative infinity to positive infinity. It's instead more like a circle, and there's only so many values on the circle before it restarts. Now if we want to show this with an integer, that's going to require quite a higher number because it can hold a lot more values because it uses more memory. So if we drop in this massive number and we run this again, you can see here where it starts over. Now we can try to do this with Python, but it's not exactly the same. So let's go into our terminal, increase this in size a bit. Now if we run that same line in just the basic Python interpreter, just the what was it, 21, 47, 48, 36, 47, and add 1 to it, no problem. And if we decide to add 10 to it, or 100 to it, it's not really a big deal. And that's because the integer range is different in Python than it is in Java, which can be a little confusing, but it is what it is. If instead, however, we use 19 decimal places and we press enter, it's fine. But if we decide to multiply that by 10, we see that L on the end. And that's because it's converted this integer into a long. Now, this and one number higher is not the value in between, but it's such a big number that I always forget what it is, but I know it's somewhere in between 19 and 20 decimal places.